Good afternoon. I'm Jim Plummer, the Dean of the Engineering School, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this afternoon. We're here to celebrate Morris Chang as one of the engineering heroes, and this is a program that's been going on for 3 years now. We have about 28 or 9 engineering heroes, and these are people who have a strong affiliation with Stanford. Many of them are our graduates, others are faculty who've served here for a while, but they're people who've changed the world in various ways. So we'll talk a bit more about Morris in just a second, but let me begin by recognizing several other people who are here. John Hennessy, who is president of Stanford University, also an engineer, and and in just a couple of minutes, Jensen Wong will get up and make a couple of remarks about Morris as well. And Jensen is also an engineer, in fact, a Stanford engineering graduate. So unlike many of our previous engineering hero...
My wife also.
I'm going to get the selfie, right. That was actually in my next paragraph here, but anyway, but I'll do it again. Good. So I also wanted to note that most of our Engineering Hero events actually have been evening events, but this one is actually being held as part of a regular Stanford class, the Entrepreneurial Thought Leaders class, and so we're delighted to have all of the students who are part of that class here to help us celebrate with Morris this afternoon. We have also a number of TSMC executives here. We're delighted to have all of you with us, and we also have a number of people from the Global Semiconductor Association, including Jody Shelton, who was helpful to us in organizing this event as well. So the way we're going to proceed this afternoon is that the main event will be a conversation between John and Morris. We'll leave time at the end for questions for those of you in the audience who might have interesting questions or comments to make. But I did want to say a couple words about the Engineering Heroes program before we do that. So as I said, there are roughly 29 people we recognize to this point as heroes of the School of Engineering. The latest class of people includes the founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, Sally Ride, who was an astronaut and a proponent of science education, and historically people like Fred Terman, Bill Hewlett, Dave Packard, and Vint Cerf are also on our list of engineering heroes. As you go out the auditorium at the back, to the right there's a wall there that has a plaque actually for each of our engineering heroes. So Morris is a Stanford PhD in electrical engineering, and since you got me off track, I forgot the paragraph. So I did.
I'm sorry.
I did want to recognize not only your wife Sophie, but also Jensen's wife Lori. And we're delighted that Lori could also be with us. So Morris is a electrical engineering PhD from Stanford, and Jensen will say a bit more about him, but he is, I think, best known worldwide, really well known worldwide, for transforming the semiconductor industry. And it was in some sense, a single idea he had back in the 1980s that made this big transformation. And at that point in time, companies that designed semiconductor silicon chips and so on, by and large had their own fabrication facilities, big factories, so they would design them and make the chips. And Morris had this key insight that, maybe with these factories getting to be as expensive as they are, perhaps we could actually share the manufacturing facilities and enable more people to build these things that perhaps couldn't afford to build their own semiconductor factories. So that was the origin of TSMC, which is the company that today is clearly the world leader in building chips for what are called fabless semiconductor companies. Now, the consequence of that has really been transformative, because not only did it result in lower costs for many companies, but it resulted in a wave of creativity and innovation, because people could now start a company designed to design semiconductor chips and do it with a few people and count on a manufacturing arm at TSMC to actually build the components that they would think about designing. So he transformed in a very real way the semiconductor industry, and I'm sure John will talk a little bit about that with him this afternoon. So with that brief introduction, let me ask Jensen Wong, who is a graduate of the also electrical engineering department here at Stanford, just to say a few words because he knows Jensen, he knows Morris really quite well, and he was going to say a few words about his relationship with him.
Okay. Good afternoon. First of all, both Jim and John, Professor Plummer, Professor Hennessy, that is, excuse me, were both of my professors. And I don't know if any of you have been so fortunate to have been taught by either of them, but I am rather the product of your work. So if you're...
And you don't hold it against us.
So this is what it looks like when we grow up.
Okay, we did okay, Jim.
Morris, the world is full of successful people, frankly, but heroes are rare. And I think that we understand the difference between the two. There is a difference between success and impact. And I'm really glad that this is partly a class, because I think that Morris, his career, his philosophies, TSMC, its strategies, its core values, is absolutely a study in industrial revolution. There is no question about it. And all of you who are interested in starting companies, changing the world, building things that matter, this is a wonderful study in that. Impact. There are very few companies that I know, that any one of you know, in fact, who has had a greater impact on society as TSMC. When I met Morris almost 20 years ago, the concept of building semiconductors, the concept of building a chip, starts with build a factory. The first thing you do is find R&D engineers, find enough money to build a factory, and if you have any money left, you would actually build a new application, a new chip that mattered. What Morris did with TSMC, his insight, was instead of being a product company, TSMC would be a platform company. It would build no products. It would enable other companies to build products. That insight, although so clear now, potentially one of the most sustainable semiconductor manufacturing business models going forward, the foundry business model, was absolutely unclear then. Was absolutely unclear then. If you look at their impact today, over $30 billion in sales, almost 1,000 customers. Instead of manufacturing one or a few products very, very well, they manufacture umpteen thousand products at a time. This is a company that manufactures, that makes something that I have utmost confidence right now as I speak that every single person in this audience has in his possession. This is the only company that I know that at this moment, there's something in your possession right now that is manufactured by them. I believe that to be a test that will pass. Whether you have an iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy or an iPad or whatever it is, of all of the companies you know in the world, this is the only company that currently has something they make in our possession right now. There are no others. So there's basically Air and TSMC. I believe that passes the test.
Is that by Confucius?
I believe that passes the test of impact. But what's really amazing is this. What's really truly amazing is this. I met Morris when I was quite young, and in fact, I've known Morris my entire company career. NVIDIA today wouldn't be here nor the other 1,000 fabless semiconductor companies wouldn't be here if not for the pioneering work that TSMC did. And the pioneering work is not semiconductor manufacturing. The pioneering work is the strategy of semiconductor manufacturing. They decided there would be a platform company. And in that platform company description, technology matters, capacity matters, pricing matters, delivery commitments matter. But the one thing that I took away from our meeting, and I tell everybody this, almost 20 years ago, was when I went to see him in Hsinchu, my walk-away message was one thing. This is a company that had technology, they had capacity, their wafer prices were relatively low, they promised to deliver on time. But my takeaway, because it said so in the brochure, it said so in all of my conversations with Morris, and it says so in everything he said over and over again, was what's going to make TSMC great is integrity and trust. And it sounded at that time, when I first met you, Morris, and don't take this wrong, sounded a little cliche, because everybody says that. But here's the fundamental difference between what he said and what he meant and why it was so important to TSMC. If you are a platform company, and you are a platform by which other companies' dreams are built from, if they can't trust you, you cannot be their platform. It's no different than the ground we stand on, a foundation we stand on, a continent we build, we immigrate to. If you can't rely on the fundamental foundation of that country, that infrastructure, that platform, you can't build an ecosystem above it. 20 years later, TSMC is not only a great company, I've already talked about its impact, but its business philosophy has become so foundational to an entire industry, whether it's EDA companies or IP companies that are in the audience or fabless semiconductor companies. There are no industry, no company, no products that I know of that TSMC is not somehow involved in. And it came from that singular vision that trust and integrity was foundational to their business. Let me just tell you a couple of stories. I've known Morris a long time, and I have a lot of business stories, but they're not very interesting. I have some personal stories that I think you'll find interesting, and it says something about his commitment and his courage. Hard to tell which one is which at the moment as I tell you the story. You decide. I think it was 1999. You will know the date, but I think it's like 1999. And it was a Friday afternoon. I got a phone call. My admin says Morris would like to drop by to see me on a Friday afternoon. And it was like my last meeting, and I was expecting TSMC sales to accommodate him, but he showed up by himself. It was him, his pencil, and his black book. Every time he pulls out his black book, it always sent chills through me. Not because he needed it. For everybody who knows him, he's impeccable with numbers. He's impeccable with numbers. He probably still remembers how many wafers I needed that year. But he dropped by and he wanted to see me. And we talked, and he asked me about business and the new products and my wafer needs for the year coming, and he wrote it down. We had a nice chat, and he left. Nobody at TSMC knew he came. I found out later that he was checking up on his customers, and in this case, it was me, and he was on his honeymoon. And I am one of the few people in the world that can say I was with Sophie and Morris on their honeymoon. That's my first story. I can't tell if it's a story of commitment or courage. Hard to say. I wanted to pick a good story that exemplifies, or both. My second story was, this is just a few years ago, and usually Morris sends an email and says he'd like to chat, and then we talk on the phone. And he had an announcement, and this announcement is that he is going to have a career change. He is going to be the CEO of TSMC again, and at first I was happy for him. I pretended to be happy for him, and the first thought was, isn't there a driver's license that you need to be a CEO of a company? And he's turned 75. This is a guy who can write on his resume, when I was 75, I applied for a job as a CEO and got it. And
Who was the chairman of the board?
And I think that there are many CEOs in the world. There are many successful people in the world, and we all love what we do, and we love what we built. But very few people at the age of 75, or maybe it was 76, comes back to take on a massive company with global scale, with just in the middle of industrial revolution, which is during the mobile revolution. And not only that, he delivered what I would estimate to be the best 5 years of his career. And it's a little bit like Jack Nicklaus 2 weeks ago saying, you know what, I think I'm going to finish all the rounds of the Masters and win it. So this is an don't forget, being a CEO is, as you know, of a large enterprise is mentally, physically challenging. I mean, this is a full contact sport. And to do it now and to do it the way that you've done is really, really extraordinary. Morris, I want to say on behalf of everybody here that we've seen a lot of success over the years, but we've never seen impact like what you've made. And on behalf of all of us, you're my hero.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, after that, I'm not sure what else we have to talk about now.
That's right.
But let's start with the point that Jensen made, the tremendous impact that TSMC has had. Not only in the creation of the fabless semiconductor industry that I think couldn't exist without that leadership, but also the tremendous impact it had on the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing and really being the spearhead for the growth of that industry. Did you anticipate those kinds of changes when you began the company? Did you think you could have that kind of impact around the world?
No, not at all, John. Actually, the very idea, the new business model, the pure play foundry business model, now everybody thinks that it was a pretty clever idea. But at the time, it was really a solution that was looking for a problem. Because, as Jensen said, it was meant to be a platform. The problem was that at the time, nobody needed that platform. There were very few fabless companies in existence at that time. There were maybe 20-some fabless companies. Now, even those fabless companies did not think that they needed a TSMC. But they felt that they would rather go to Toshiba, NEC, Hitachi, Fujitsu, or even Intel or TI for fab service, foundry service. Now, of course, I mean, those big guys, the Japanese companies, the Intels and TIs, really didn't want them, and they would make wafers for the little fabless companies only at a very steep price, not a financial steep price, but the price of wanting their designs for their own sales, for their own product sales. But still, we were not trusted enough, our technology was not trusted enough that they would come to us. And the big companies obviously didn't need us. Now, so it was a solution waiting for a problem to happen. Now, the problem happened pretty quickly in the early 90s. And I think that our existence certainly helped to accelerate the formation of a lot of fabless companies. There were maybe 25 fabless companies in the whole world in 1985, 86, and then 10 years later, there were 400, 500 fabless companies. And some of the big ones were started in that period, in that 10-year period.
Yeah. I mean, having worked in a fabless company, been involved in starting two of them, one before TSMC that had to do exactly as you said, go form partnerships with the big players who this was not their primary business, and then forming one at Theros with TSMC. It was night and day.
Yeah.
Completely different kind of experience.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. I
So
know.
talk about the impact on Taiwan as well. I mean, the catapulting of Taiwan into the semiconductor manufacturing business in a big way.
I think in many ways we were the first in Taiwan. We were not the first semiconductor company in Taiwan. Taiwan had other semiconductor companies before TSMC started. But we certainly became the most successful semiconductor company in Taiwan after a few years, after only a few years. And also, I think that we really set a model, I hope, for Taiwan in corporate governance, in innovations. Almost 99% of Taiwan companies operate with hair-thin gross margin. Gross margin 4 or 5%, and they don't have money for R&D. They don't even have money for sales marketing, for heaven's sake, with 4 or 5% gross margin. And we, I believe, were the first company that showed them that to be a world-class company, to be a real successful company, you needed to have R&D, you needed to have good sales marketing, and because you needed to have R&D, your gross margin would have to be in the 40-50% range.
Right.
Yeah. So I think we set the first example, and on corporate governance, I believe that we set an example also. So I think TSMC did begin to acquire a different meaning in Taiwan as a corporation.
Yeah. So tell me, I think Jensen alluded to this focus, and you said it too, pure play. This focus on manufacturing excellence, on R&D and manufacturing designed to bring new semiconductor lines to production faster. How did you decide to focus on that? How did that become the central focus point for TSMC?
Well, because one reason, in fact, maybe the principal reason, was that at the time I started TSMC, I had already worked in the industry, semiconductor industry, for 30 years. Right. I joined the industry in 1955 and started TSMC in 1985. And I had already been the head of the largest semiconductor operation business in the world, Texas Instruments.
TI, right.
Yeah. So there was a Song Dynasty Chinese poem that said that to be the leader, the first thing you have to do is to climb to the top of a high building and look down on all the available roads in the world. And I did that actually at TI. I occupy perhaps the height of the industry, yeah, and looked at all the available routes. And there wasn't really any for a newcomer to compete, you know. So I had to figure out a new road. And the new road was this new business model.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the problem was that it was a solution looking for a problem. But happily, the problem occurred.
You know, I think
And Jensen was one of the problems.
yeah, that's right. It was one of the good problems that occurred. But I think you undersell this point, Morris, because there were some earlier attempts at silicon foundries, but they had mixed business models. They were CAD tools combined with companies that had manufacturing lines, they never put the focus on manufacturing excellence. I think Jensen hit on trust. You want your customers to trust TSMC. You better be manufacturing excellence.
Yeah, that certainly, and I mean I owe a lot to a lot of people. I owe a lot to my own family, my own early upbringing, which did instill in me values of integrity and being trustworthy and so on. I owe a lot to the education I received. Stanford. And Stanford, although I spent only 2.5 years, well, I must mention Harvard and MIT as well.
Right. Exactly.
And, but the 2.5 years I spent at Stanford getting my PhD, I think were very important years, decisive years for me, because I had started to work already in the semiconductor industry before I came to Stanford for my PhD. And I have to say now that before I started working, my studying at MIT was really not serious. I really didn't know what I wanted in life. But then I started working, and I knew what I wanted now when I came to Stanford. I have been at TI, I've been in industry for 6 years already, and I have been at TI for 3 years. And I was on the rise at TI. And they sent me to Stanford to get my PhD. I already knew what I wanted. And I was a very, very diligent and serious and hard-working student. That was the only time I was a hard-working, diligent, serious student.
So I'm sure the students would like to know the secret of finishing a PhD in 2.5 years.
Being diligent and hardworking.
Good. It's the right answer. So tell me how the pieces of your education fit together. As you said, you were at Harvard first, and then you switched to MIT.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And then went to work before you came here.
Yeah.
What happened there? Why did you switch from Harvard to MIT? Harvard's not such a bad place to get a degree from.
Not at all. It was, in fact, even now, I consider that to be my most exciting year. I was freshman. I just spent the freshman year. But remember, the time was 1949 to 1950. And there were very, very few Chinese, there was no Chinese Chinese-American politician. There was no Chinese-American even businessman. There were Chinese-American laundry people. There were Chinese-American restaurant people. Now, the only really serious profession, I would say middle-class profession, that a Chinese-American could pursue in the early 50s would be technical, research or development, engineering work. Yeah. So, although Harvard was a very exciting year, but Harvard didn't even have engineering as a specialty. Harvard, the undergraduates were general education. I didn't think I could find a job, a good job anyway, if I got a bachelor's degree at Harvard. So
We probably would have still let you in, Morris.
Well, so I switched to MIT the second year, and I switched to mechanical engineering. Yeah. Oh. And then, as I said, I really wasn't all that interested in mechanical engineering or in engineering at all. I was a lot more interested in politics, business, economics, general things, So that's why Harvard was far more interesting to me than MIT turned out to be. But I went on, of course, anyway. And in fact, I wanted to get a PhD at MIT. However, I failed the PhD qualifying exam. And they allow you to take it twice, I think it's the same rule as Stanford there. Yeah. They allow you to take it twice, and I failed both times. So what was I to do? And I decided that I would just go to work. And I was kind of sick and tired of mechanical engineering anyway. So I went to work for a new semiconductor company, Sylvania. And then after 3 years at Sylvania, the new semiconductor division of Sylvania, after 3 years, and I remembered one classic address that the general manager of that division gave to all his indirect employees, and there were maybe 150 of us. We were gathered in the cafeteria, and he made one classic comment that I remember to this day. He said, our trouble at Sylvania is that we cannot make what we can sell, and we cannot sell what we can make. Now, ever since then, I've tried to stay away from that. At TI later, and of course at TSMC, and I should say I've successfully stayed away.
Yeah. Well, that's why TI and TSMC around and Sylvania isn't. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So tell me about the time when you first returned to Taiwan. You headed ITRI,
I first went to Taiwan.
Went to Taiwan.
Yeah, right.
Yes, went to Taiwan.
Taiwan was a strange place to me. A new place, a strange place. When I first went there in 1985. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was the first time you had actually been there.
Well, I had visited it a few times. Yeah.
But so you returned to head ITRI, to head this industrial group that the government had.
Right. Yeah.
Tell me about that time and how that influenced your view of the semiconductor industry and what could happen in Taiwan.
You mean ITRI?
At ITRI.
ITRI had a semiconductor pilot line, actually semiconductor development project for 10 years, ever since 1975. In 1975, the premier of Taiwan, the prime minister of Taiwan, had the foresight to start a semiconductor development project in Taiwan, in ITRI, in this Industrial Technology Research Institute in Taiwan. And it got its technology, well, it sent out invitation for bids for people, American companies, to transfer technology, semiconductor technology, to ITRI. And there were several bidders, and the winning bidder was RCA. ITRI got its technology, early technology, CMOS technology, from RCA. And then from that point on, they started to follow, to continue to develop their technology. The problem was that it was only a development project. So the RCA technology was about one generation old anyway, one generation behind when it was transferred to ITRI. And then when I arrived in 1985, which was 10 years after they started, they had become 2 generations behind. In spite of their very hard work, but they just couldn't keep up with the technology progress that that most other semiconductor companies in the U.S. at that time did. So we started, TSMC started with that technology, with the ITRI technology, which was 2 generations behind the current technology. But we managed to start to catch up. And I would say that it took us perhaps 10 years, the first 10 years of TSMC. And now, of course, we start to have enough business volume to support a much higher level of R&D than ITRI could.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did the thought of starting a semiconductor manufacturing company and the capital that requires seems quite daunting. How did you get that company launched?
Well, the government first promised to be a 50%, the largest investor, 50%, up to 50%. And so it was my job to get the other 50%. Of course, it turned out that even though the premier promised that the government would invest 50% in TSMC, I still had to get the bureaucracy's agreement, which took actually not just a few months, but also a lot of heartache.
Yes, patience of a saint.
Patience, yeah. But of course, the harder part, of course, was to get the other 50%. And the premier told me that I needed to get a technology, a multinational technology company to be an anchor investor. And then if I get this multinational technology company to be the anchor investor, then it would be easier. He would help me to get the rest from Taiwan business community. So I spent about 8 months to get Philips. Well, actually, I had written letters to a lot of people: Intel, TI, Toshiba, Hitachi, NEC, Sony. And actually, 3 companies gave me presentation opportunities. Intel did, I wrote to Gordon Moore, and Gordon wrote back that he said that I have asked Craig Barrett, who was at that time his CTO, I think, to see me. So I talked to Craig twice, 2 separate occasions. But at the end of the second occasion, he said, "No, we're not interested." And TI the same way. Saw him twice. Saw TI twice. I went to Dallas twice, and the same way. At the end of the second meeting, he said no. Mark Shepard said no.
Too bad for him, huh?
But the only company that appeared to be interested, genuinely interested, was Philips.
Interesting.
Yeah. I had wanted somebody better in technology, and Philips, in terms of semiconductor technology, I had described them as being in the first row of second raters. But I had to settle. I had to settle for them. Yeah.
Interesting.
So I got them. And they invested 28%. So I had 48%. It turned out to be 48% from the government, Taiwan government, 28% from Philips, and then the remaining 23, 24%, I guess, I got from about 12 or 13 companies. And that was very interesting too. What generally happened was that one of the ministers in the government would call a businessman in Taiwan and told him that he would send me to give a presentation to that businessman to get him to invest. So I was on that kind of trips, a dozen times. And there was one pretty big investor, a 5% investor, that actually balked when the Minister of Economic Affairs in Taiwan first called him and told him that he wanted to send me. He said, okay. So I went there actually 3 separate times. He and his staff sat down with me for dinner, and none of those people knew anything about semiconductors. But they would keep quizzing me, at dinner, and I wasn't even able to. I didn't even have time to eat anything. It was, twice. This happened 2 times. Dinner 2 times. Dinner and the interrogation 2 times. And then he called the Minister of Economic Affairs, the big businessman, called the minister back and said, no, I'm not going to invest. Well, the minister, of course, was unhappy, but he told the premier that. The premier said, let me call this guy. And so the premier told me later that he called this guy. The premier also told me, he said, I told him, the government has been very good to you in the last 20 years. You better do something. You better do something for the government now.
Well, that worked. That worked. Any way you can get the money, I guess.
That worked. That worked. Yeah.
So when you look at this, you look at what's happened historically. It's really fascinating because in the late 70s and early 80s, I think there was this thought that Japan would take over the entire semiconductor industry. Yeah. And in fact, that has not been what's happened. In fact, there was the rise of TSMC and Taiwan semiconductor industry. Then now mainland China, Korea, obviously. How do you see what really caused this kind of evolution and these changes?
Well, I really think that the problem with the Japanese industry was that they never created a fabless industry.
Right.
It was the fabless industry in the United States that came up with all the innovations, almost all the innovations in the last 20 years. So, I mean, there was this industry, Japanese semiconductor industry conference, 5 or 6 years ago. And I was invited to attend, but I was not invited to participate in a panel that they had. So the panelists were all the Japanese industrialists, semiconductor industrialists, sitting up there discussing that they wanted the government to fund a common fab for them now, like TSMC. That's what they said, up on the stage. And I was sitting downstage. I was really getting very impatient. But then finally they stopped talking, and the chairman of the panel asked if anybody in the audience wanted to make any comment. So I raised my hand. I said, and they all knew me anyway. I said, I don't think your problem was not having a common fab, huh? Your problem was that you just never had a fabless company. It was the fabless companies, that the big difference that has occurred in the last, at that time, it was, I think, something like 2005. Between 1985 and 2005, the 20-year time period, the Japanese market share had dropped 20%, 20 points. And the American market share had gone up 20 points. And the fabless, in the meantime, all American, went from 0 to 20%.
Right. Right.
And that was the difference.
Yeah. Well, not only did they didn't do that, but they also didn't go into the hardcore foundry business, the pure play foundry business, which they could have done. They had the technology early on. They were good at the manufacturing side, but they decided not to do it, I guess.
But I wouldn't have welcomed them to that.
I know you would. They were afraid of you, Morris.
I would have welcomed them to create a fabulous industry that we could then serve.
No doubt. So one thing I know that you also have a great love and appreciation of the arts and the humanities. You mentioned your year at Harvard. Tell me how that's affected you, your leadership, the style with which you've led TSMC.
It certainly has made my life a lot more interesting. I am interested in both English and Chinese literature, and I'm interested in classical music. So whatever leisure time I have, I will read Chinese literature, English literature. In fact, the two books that I have very near to my bed, I read them usually, in the hour or two when I was too tired to read anything serious. The two books, one is Chinese, it's the Red Chamber Stream, it's a Chinese classic. And the other is Shakespeare's plays. And I'm particularly interested in the Shakespeare's tragedies. And there's a lot of meaning, I think, a lot of life's lessons in Shakespeare's play. And I'm interested in music. I'm interested in history in general, in biography, and all those, I think, add a great deal to my life's interest, I think. And I think that my business experience, I think, benefits from some of these lessons that I learned in outside reading, too. I often compare I am a student of the Second World War, the main battles and so on. Often compare the competitive battles that TSMC goes through with competitors, compare them with the battles in the Second World War. Stalingrad and all that stuff.
Stalingrad, that's a tough one to start with. The Siege of Leningrad.
Stalingrad was the one I was very interested in because, well, actually the Midway, the naval battle. You know, the Japanese commander couldn't make up his mind whether to keep the bombers on deck or the fighters on deck. You know,
and he changed it.
He changed. Well, you know that too. Yeah, he changed it, and that cost him the battle.
Indecision is a very bad thing in war and in leading companies.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So, final question before we open up the floor. What advice would you give to the students who are here who seek to have some impact, have a life that really achieves great things? And many of them, most of them will be in some engineering discipline. What advice would you give them?
Learn and think. Both are important.
Both are important.
Very well. Here I go to a Confucian statement. Learning and thinking are both important. If you just learn and don't think, then you quickly become lost. If you just think and don't learn, then you quickly run out of material to think.
Okay, let's open up the floor we have 15 minutes or so for questions. And do we have mics or what do we have here, Jim? Okay.
At least one. I'm happy to help.
The conditions you describe at the founding of TSMC are very similar to the conditions that exist today in the MEMS industry. And I know
I'm sorry, I have a little trouble hearing. Yeah, could you be a little louder, perhaps?
Is the mic on?
Hello?
There it is.
Okay. So I was saying the conditions that existed at the start of TSMC are very similar to the conditions that exist currently in the MEMS industry. And I know that...
In what industry?
In MEMS. MEMS.
Microelectromechanical.
So, and I know TSMC is doing business in MEMS now. It's a very small part of your revenue. But I was curious what your vision is for MEMS for TSMC, and particularly whether you think TSMC can standardize MEMS the way it did for CMOS technology.
Can TSMC standardize MEMS?
Standardize the MEMS-based technology, I guess, right? That's really the key.
Standardize?
Yeah, create a standard-based technology on which MEMS
That's what we hope to do.
Yeah.
In fact, that's true, isn't it? Mark is one of our co-CEOs.
We have that platform already.
Yeah. Yes, and I really think that MEMS is a very major part of what we call, in general, the next big thing. You know, the current big thing is all these smartphones and tablets, the mobile products. What is the next big thing? Well, the next big thing, I don't know exactly what it is. I guess it's probably the Internet of Things, the wearables, and those things. But whatever, I think it's very probably the Internet of Things and wearables. Anyway, MEMS will play a big part in those. So we really have high hopes for MEMS. TSMC has high hopes for MEMS.
Well, and Morris, you did achieve this in the mobile industry. In the beginning, there weren't standards, particularly for the analog side of it, and you needed analog to go into the mobile business. And you did become a leader in kind of creating a standardized platform that people could design on. And
That's
you did
right.
this because
Yeah.
you were willing to collaborate
Yeah.
with the early fabless companies as they came along and developed that standard. I think
And that's what we're trying to do in MEMS. Yeah.
So when you spun out of ITRI, do you think that could have been done just as a start, or was it really important to have a government foundation there and it kind of spun out of that? And the second question then is that a useful model to think in terms of manufacturing generally around the world, or especially in the U.S., spinning out manufacturing capability out of our national labs?
I really think that the Taiwan, the TSMC, ITRI, Taiwan, the three were in combination. I think that was a pretty unique one. First of all, I didn't go to Taiwan to start TSMC at all. I went to Taiwan to be the president of ITRI. And I thought I was going to retire in that job, you know. And the person that recruited me to that job was not the same person that asked me to start TSMC. In fact, the two of them were not friendly to each other, you know. And the person that eventually asked me to start TSMC was unhappy because the other guy had recruited me to the ITRI job. And anyway, 2 weeks after I arrived in the ITRI job, this other minister who was unhappy because he didn't recruit me asked me to go to see him. And at that time he said, you ought to start TSMC. And well, of course, he didn't really understand semiconductor industry very well. So when he said you ought to start a semiconductor company, he meant something like the conventional IDM. But I came up with a different with the TSMC business model.
Different game plan.
Yeah, different game plan. And he had the confidence in me because he knew what I had done at TI. So he trusted me. So even though he didn't understand what a foundry was, he trusted me. Yeah.
So do you think it was a unique situation, or could that model be more generally expanded?
I think it was a pretty unique situation. You first you have to start with the insight that the Taiwan government had back 10 years earlier in 1975 when they started this the SEED group, this development group in ITRI. It was pretty big money for them at that time. It was, even just the RCA contract, the technology transfer contract, was $4 or $5 million, which was big money for the Taiwan government at that time. And then sustaining their own development activity, that probably cost a few $1 million a year, and that was pretty big money for the Taiwan government. But they did it. And then, of course, when the time came, when I started to set up TSMC, and the premier, the second minister, and the premier said they would support 50%. They didn't know that it was going to be 50% of 220 million. They thought it was a much smaller number than that. Yeah. But they swallowed that also. So it was.
I'll bet they're happy they swallowed that.
They're very happy now.
Yes, exactly.
Recently, some people claim that beyond 28 nanometers, the cost per transistor is not going to scale. They say that 28 nanometer is the last technology node that is going to have basically the lowest cost. Could you comment on that, or do you agree with
John,
this?
can you repeat that to me?
The question is, below 28 nanometers, will we get any cost improvements in the price of per transistor? Some people claim that's the end of the road in terms of price drops per transistor.
Well, I think it does become more difficult, but I think it will still happen. Now, I think there's a controversy going on, and whatever. But I would say that it will continue to happen. We'll still get lower cost transistor, maybe not the decrease in cost, maybe will not be at the same rate as it happened before, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Chairman, considering your love for literature, is there an autobiography in the works?
What?
Is there an autobiography in the works?
Well, actually, I wrote one in Chinese, and it was a bestseller in Taiwan.
Appropriately so.
It was the envy of a lot of professional writers in Taiwan. We sold almost 200,000 copies, which constituted a very good seller in Taiwan. And in fact, I had it translated into English by a couple of professional translators, but I didn't like the translation. I didn't like the result.
And Shakespeare wasn't available, so.
So I didn't publish it. I didn't publish the English version of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you. I think you'll like this one. Any advice to a startup that specializes in buying and selling primarily secondary semiconductor manufacturing equipment on how to start a new relationship with TSMC?
A startup that specializes in buying and selling of used semiconductor equipment?
Yes, and we just actually started a new office in Taiwan.
I do think there's a market for that, yes. In fact, even today, if we would be interested in buying some used equipment. But whether I would advise a startup like that, I don't know. I have to think about that. Yeah, but there is a market for it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a market. There's definitely a market.
Other questions? Yes.
So I have a question. If you read Macbeth just before you go to sleep, doesn't it give you nightmares? Thinking of the witches there.
I generally, even though I'm primarily interested in Shakespeare's tragedies, but for bedtime reading,
Romeo and Juliet's a lot. Well, that's a tragedy too, I guess.
Or perhaps The Merchant of Venice.
Yes,
anyway.
okay, there we go.
I represent the fabless industry. We started a company, a semiconductor company in Connecticut. The name of it was Transwitch. We used your foundry, and it worked out beautifully. It's a wonderful business model to have fabless in your capabilities, and as you point out, it's key to the industry itself. But I want to thank you and keep up your foundry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I also, before we finish, I also want to say that Jensen actually referred to my being on honeymoon when I visited him. The year, by the way, was not 1999. It was 2001.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, but what I want to say is that ever since then, I think Sophie's support has been very, very important. And when Jensen refers to my last 5 years being the CEO again of TSMC, actually I didn't become CEO again at the age of 75, as you said. I became CEO again at the age of 78. But anyway, last 10 or 11 years, actually 13 years, I think Sophie's support was most significant. It must.
Picking the right life partner is another important lesson one can learn in life.
Oh yeah. Well said, John. Well said. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Morris. It's a non-technical and non-business question. How do you kick your smoking habit? I know you used to smoke when you were in graduate school.
How did I kick it?
Yeah.
How do you kick it? Or you have ever kicked it?
I really haven't kicked it. My philosophy on smoking is this. I smoke a pipe, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah. And I know that pipe smoking, I think is better than cigarette smoking. In fact, I have read statistics.
But it's not in the good column, Morris.
Not in the good column?
No.
Well,
it's better.
that's what you say. But the statistics I saw say that a pipe smoker actually lives longer than a non-smoker.
Really?
Yeah. And the way I see it,
This is in a journal for pipe smokers, I'm sure.
The way I see it is that while pipe smoking is injurious to your physical health, but maybe it helps your mood. Maybe and I think that a person's mood is very important to his health. You know.
I try a nice glass of red wine, I think.
That's right.
All right. Let's get another question here.
So, Dr. Chan, I have a question. Now, everybody knows, these data integrated circuits process, the circuit design complexity is getting higher and higher, so the process is more complicated. But at the same time, the consumer electronics side are demanding, faster time to market, being able to deliver a product in a shorter life cycle. So, in your view, how do you, or what would be the challenge facing forward and balance out these two different requirements that are coming in the?
Sorry. John, maybe you can.
I think the question revolves around the complexity of circuit design and logic design now with these complex chips has become really significant. I mean, look at Jensen's products, for example. And yet there's demand to deliver products in ever shorter periods of time. How do you see those two really meshing together and being resolved?
Well, I think that there is a tendency that the fabless companies are consolidating. I think there'll be fewer in 5 years or 10 years. So there are. I think some of them will be acquired by others.
So do you think we'll see a model?
Jensen will be acquiring people.
Yeah, he'll be buying people, right? I mean, will a model emerge? I mean, if you look at how Intel does design, they have multiple teams working sort of in a leapfrog fashion, one after the other, because the design takes so long, and perhaps we'll see more of that emerge over time.
Yeah.
So we have one more question.
Hi, Dr. Chan. I have a question about your decision of going back to Taiwan. You were a really very successful person in TI back in 1985. And what do you see in Taiwan that give you the courage to go back to Taiwan?
Well, I felt that, actually at TI, I did not achieve what I wanted to achieve, which was the CEO job at TI.
He only headed the entire semiconductor unit, but
so now by 1983, I was actually told very plainly that I would not be the CEO of TI. So I left in that year. I went to General Instrument in New York. to become their COO with the expectation that I would become the CEO in perhaps 3 or 4 years. Now, after a year, however, in General Instrument, although I still could be CEO in another 2 or 3 years, but I decided I would not want to be the CEO of General Instrument. So I was now at a crossroads. I was in a company where I really didn't want to be the CEO. Now, at that time, Taiwan began to beckon, so I decided that would be a good. It was a risk, but I was I was 54 years old. I felt I could still afford to take a risk, and I had achieved a measure of financial independence with my TI and the General Instrument stock options, all that sort of things. It's nothing like what you would consider wealth today, you know. But financial independence to me meant at that time that I didn't need a job. I could just live on the interest of the money I had, which was true, you know. So the interest rate was actually high at that time too. But still, I did have a financial independence, so I decided to take a risk.
And that road less taken is what turned you into an engineering hero. I think it's really remarkable.
Thank you.
One more really quick question. So,
I hope it's a good one.
I hope to. Segueing from your point about the CEO, so what are the top 3 things or 5 things, whatever you want to share, you feel would be important for a CEO, or, I mean, maybe in a corporate and in a startup?
3 or 5 things that you think are important for being a great CEO.
Oh, of course, it depends on what kind of company you're a CEO of. If you talk about a reasonably big company, let's say $10 billion and up kind of company, I think a CEO's main job is to bring the outside to the inside. The outside is, customers, shareholders, society, the world. Bring the outside to the inside and maximize the inside performance to cope with the outside. I think that's the main job, CEO's main job.
Really insightful comment. So I'd like to just finish up by telling Morris that those of you who have been outside the back of this room and gone to the right will have seen a wall that has plaques like this on it for each of the engineering heroes. And so this is a replica for Morris of the plaque which is now hanging out there on the wall. So I'd like to thank Morris and John and Jensen. This has been a thoroughly interesting conversation. There is a reception outside back for those of you here in the auditorium. Those of you watching over the internet will have to presume that you aren't going to be here, but those of you who are here, please continue with us outside in the reception area. And thank you all for coming.